This podcast is brought to you by WRFL, Radio Free Lexington. Find us online at wrfl.fm. Catch us on your FM radio while you're in Central Kentucky at 88.1 FM, all the way to the left. Thank you for listening, and please be sure to subscribe.
Hi, welcome to From the Woods, Kentucky. I'm Lhotka, and I'm here with my co-host, Renee Williams. And today in studio, we have Dr. Chris Barton. And Dr. Barton is a professor of forest hydrology and watershed management in the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources at the University of Kentucky. It's a pleasure to have you in studio today. And today, we've had you on before talking about Green Forest Works, but today we want to talk about what you do with, forest hydrology and watershed management. And can you tell people just a little bit about what you do here at UK before we get into our interview?
Well, sure. I teach and I do research here in the Department of Forestry. My research, we talked last time, about some of the ecological restoration work I do. But really, my background is in soils and water, and much of the work, my research, and my students were focusing on how land use, and land use could be anything from mining to, urban development to agricultural activities or forestry, logging, for instance, how those land use activities influence water resources at a watershed level. So, we're really looking at, activities that we do within a watershed, what impact those are having on the amount of water, the quality of water, and ultimately, things that rely on that water, like aquatic, insects or salamanders or fish or people. So the watershed approach to looking at, environmental issues is kind of a neat way to look at it, because you're sort of looking at the big picture. Right. And not just specifically, this activity affects this. It's like how everything in the watershed works together and interacts with each other to, influence our water resources.
Okay. And I guess, can you kind of start at the beginning and define what a watershed is and kind of explain that?
Well, yeah, there's like many definitions of a watershed. The one that I use most frequently is sort of a topographically delineated area where all the water in that area drains to a specific point. So you can sort of think of it as a catchment is a phrase that we use a lot. And when it rains down on that catchment, if you want to picture your hand, all the water comes into the palm of your hand. It would drip down your arm if you had it in a certain angle. And so a watershed, to me, in the biggest sense, it's that catchment. It's that area that's catching water, and that water's moving to a particular point and leaving that watershed. So now the size of a watershed is very important, because it varies. It can be a few acres, it could be hundreds of acres, it could be millions of acres. So, in Lexington we have several watersheds. For instance, Town Branch is a small watershed that's draining downtown Lexington, and that drains into Elkhorn Creek, which is draining a bigger portion of Fayette County. That drains into the Kentucky River watershed, which, includes lots of eastern and central Kentucky, into the Ohio River watershed, the Mississippi River watershed, which is a watershed that encompasses, over a third of the land area in the lower 48 states. So thinking about what's going on in those particular watersheds and how to manage it becomes sort of an issue of scale, thinking about that small headwater stream, say in Robinson Forest or somewhere, versus the Mississippi River watershed, two completely different scales. But the thing that they have in common is that, the activities that we do within those watersheds ultimately influence the water resources. So we kind of need to think about that that's the other part of what watersheds are, is a way of guiding activities and planning and developing policy for protecting our water resources within this defined area.
You said there were several. How many are in Kentucky?
How many watersheds?
Uh-huh.
I have no idea.
A lot? Okay.
So one thing we do have in Kentucky is a wealth of water resources, and Kentucky has the most miles of streams of any state outside of Alaska.
Oh.
So we have an abundance of water, which is good. And so depending on how you delineate those watersheds, we have several major river basins, but we have thousands and thousands of little headwater streams that flow into larger watersheds. So I've never sat down and tried to count that, but maybe that'll be something I can do in my retirement.
And so is there anything unique about Kentucky's watersheds? I mean, you mentioned that we have the most miles of streams, but anything unique?
Well, so as far as unique, we don't have anything that's particularly unique, but what we do have, again, is sort of an abundance of these resources. And in Kentucky, it's kind of interesting, too, that because of the geology and geography of our state, we have very different stream types and watershed types. So we have small mountainous headwater watersheds in eastern Kentucky. And then our watersheds in central Kentucky tend to be influenced by the karst topography. So we have kind of interesting streams that are above ground sometimes, and then they go down below ground into a cave system for a while and may spring out somewhere again. So that's kind of an interesting, unique watershed type. And out in far western Kentucky, we have more of streams that are similar to the Mississippi River floodplain. And so windy, long, relatively flat type of stream. So you could expect from east to west in the state, not only, do we have differences in stream types, but we're going to have differences in what aquatic communities use those, and and how we actually manage them is going to be different from east to central to west Kentucky, just because of the topographic differences.
And so can you tell us a little bit about the research that you're doing and what parts you're looking at?
Right. So we've done a lot of research, just looking again at how different, land use activities affect our water resources. And a big part of that has been in eastern Kentucky and looking at things like mining and logging. And so how those activities are going to affect water quality, the amount of water, and the things that reside within these water sources and utilize them. So, and those are two completely different types of disturbances. So one of the things that we've been really focusing on is how do we minimize impacts from those disturbance types? And so with, logging, for instance, we did a big study at Robinson Forest where we evaluated the importance of using streamside management zones. And these are a riparian buffer, or a buffer that's adjacent to the stream, that are very important for protecting the water resources. They provide shade, they provide leaves and wood that support the aquatic food webs. They hold the banks together with their roots, and so prevent erosion and sedimentation in the streams. And so in Kentucky, for instance, we have sort of a best management practice, or a recommendation that we have loggers use to protect our water resources. And the one we had in Kentucky was we were going to leave in steep sloped areas, for instance, like in eastern Kentucky, leave a 55-foot buffer, and we can remove 50% of the trees within that buffer. And, that sounds pretty good, but there was no scientific basis for that recommendation. It was sort of consensus science between, water research people in, the southeast United States. It's like, 100-foot, 50-foot. Kentucky, we'll go with 55 feet.
Sounds good.
Yeah, exactly. So we were able to go out to Robinson Forest and actually test that. So we looked at 55 feet and removal of 50% of the trees within that buffer, and we compared that to, okay, we'll leave it at 55 feet, but we won't take any trees out. And then how about if we double the size to 110 feet and don't allow any trees to, be harvested in that area? And then we log in the watershed above these streams and look at the impact and compare that to an unlogged or control watershed. And one of the things that we found that actually the recommendation we had been, providing 55 feet and 50% removal was actually doing a pretty good job. But we found when we left 110 feet and didn't remove any of those trees that nearly every parameter that we looked at, from all the water quality standards to the bug community to the salamander community to temperature, sediment, the flow regime, none of those changed. And the logging intensity was the same, for all of these watersheds. So when we looked at that, in retrospect, it's like, wow, so here's just a little simple activity that we can do to help, protect our water resources by just increasing, the buffer around our streams by 50 feet. And so we were actually able to utilize that to make new and improved recommendations, especially for designated waters that are considered high water quality, resources or outstanding water quality resources, or where there might be some sensitive species in the stream. It's like, this is, the standard we need to use now. And that's actually become part of our, state regulations for logging. And so here's an example of where our research has led, to changes in policy in our state. And we're, it was a long, that's like a 10-year long study where you have to do this. But I think it's important that we have the resources and the ability and good students to help conduct this type of research and really, do something positive for the environment of, in this case, Eastern Kentucky. But and that project relates to the hilly areas of Appalachia and the Cumberland Plateau, so it can be extended to a multi-state area. And, and similarly with the mining work, just going out and identifying different mining and reclamation practices that will prevent sediment runoff or, lessen the amount of water quality impacts that we have from those activities. And that's been a really good working, sort of relationship, not only within, our forestry department, but within, engineering, ag engineering, and soils, plant and soil sciences. There's been a lot of people who've been working, collectively to try to address some of those watershed issues.
So you're talking about those streamside management zones. Does it matter whether you're in Western Kentucky or Eastern Kentucky on the different changes that might need to be? Did you research?
We haven't done that yet,
okay.
But that is something, clearly the way that the law has been written is the streamside management zone width is based upon the slope of your landscape. And so we're generally going to have much greater slopes.
It's different in Eastern and Western.
Than Western. Yeah. So the width of that riparian buffer is actually adjusted based upon that.
Okay.
So that would be a good follow-up, is to go and do a similar type of study in Western Kentucky forest and see how, what we're using there is based upon what we think are the best recommendations, but we really haven't scientifically examined that. And so that would be a good area to move to next.
And tell us a little bit about your other research that you've done at Robinson Forest, just kind of monitoring the water quality there and the history of that data.
Yeah, so Robinson Forest became basically a hydrologic monitoring network in the early 1970s. I think we have data going back on several watersheds since 1972, and that's continuous data. And
do you see that a lot, having that much data?
No. So there are very few places in the U.S. where you can have continuous, we're talking now, over 40 years worth of data. And there are, some networks around, but that's the nice thing is there's like one in each state, and some states don't even have any. So we're getting information that's very specific to sort of the central Appalachian region, definitely Eastern Kentucky. And our water quality area is sort of unique that it's right in the heart of the coal mining area of Kentucky. So the data that we get tells us a lot. So we're collecting water samples every week and get water quality. We have continuously monitored stream flow. And so we can go and look, and we also continuously monitor rain or precipitation. And so we know this relationship between rain events and flooding and droughts and water quality. And then if there's something that happens within these watersheds, we can look and see how that changes. Like if insects come in and, take out a stand, or if we do some logging or something like that. But also because it's right in the heart of the coal belt or the coal mining area in eastern Kentucky, we can look at, as using our watersheds as sort of a control. We can see what kind of effects nearby mining is having on those water resources, and then compare it to the baseline that we have at Robinson Forest.
You've been listening to From the Woods, Kentucky with co-hosts Renee and Laura. We'll be right back after this short break.
Welcome to Wildlife Sounds from the Forest. This is Dr. Matt Springer. For those of you who may be just joining us, each week towards the beginning of the show, we will play a wildlife sound from the forest. So here's our sound for today. Stay tuned. Towards the end of the show, we will tell you what this animal is and why it makes this sound.
Welcome back to From the Woods, Kentucky. We've been talking with Dr. Chris Barton, Professor of Forest Hydrology and Watershed Management in the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources at the University of Kentucky. Let's get back to our show.
But it's not just about, active stuff that we can see. So Robinson Forest is one of only, I think, maybe 2, maybe 3 places in the U.S. where we can see how changes in big environmental policy have affected water resources. So the Clean Air Act, since it has been enacted, we've seen a reduction in the amount of sulfur in the atmosphere of over 50%.
Wow.
So since, the 80s to present, it's about 60% reduction in sulfur emissions. And that's from, technology advances, use of scrubbers on power plants, and also they didn't burn as much, high sulfur coal and different technological advances in automotive emissions and things like that. So the Clean Air Act has really done a good job of doing what it was supposed to do. But it's difficult to show that on the landscape because there's so many other things that are happening, with in an urban environment especially. But at Robinson Forest, nothing's been going on for the most part in many of these areas that we monitor. And, there was logging there in about the late 19 teens up to about 1920. And then much of that area has just regrown. So we're looking at 100-year-old second growth forest now. And one of the things that we've been able to show in several of the streams there is that the sulfur concentration in the stream water has actually gone down by about 50% since the 1980s. So here we have an Environmental Protection Act that, said, okay, we're going to remove X amount of sulfur from the atmosphere. And we're seeing it in the stream. So that's a great example of how these long-term, research areas can be utilized for examining, environmental protection acts or looking at even climate change. So that's a big area that we're hoping to move into is we have the data to look at, how changes in our global climate have actually expressed themselves in our forest. So it's a very valuable resource from a research perspective. We just got a grant actually from the National Science Foundation to upgrade all of our equipment that we have out there that's doing this monitoring and make the data available online. So kind of real-time data. So hopefully by this time next year, you will have a site that you can go in on your computer and actually pull up, real-time data from the forest. And so that'll be a great, for our students in classes we teach, because it's kind of hard to get them 3 hours out to Robinson Forest. If we can pull up the data right here in our classroom, that's a great thing. But for other scientists that we work with the EPA and, different federal agencies and other universities, they'll have access, to that data to help with their research as well.
You've mentioned a lot of this research is going on at Robinson Forest, and we've done some shows in the past on Robinson Forest, but could you kind of explain to listeners who may not know where Robinson Forest is and how many acres it might be?
Sure. So Robinson Forest is about a 15,000 acre forest in parts of Breathitt, Perry, and Knott County, Kentucky. And the main block, the forest is comprised of the main block, which is about 10,000 acres. And then it has some satellite blocks that range, from a few thousand to a few hundred acres. And the main block has really where we have our camp and where students go. Our NRES, Natural Resource Environmental Science students, have a camp that they have there, 3-week-long camp, and our forestry students spend time there. And other groups, the English department used to have classes there, and it's used for a lot of activities with extension and teaching, research, training, so on and so forth. But the main block of the forest is where our sort of main hydrology research is going on, and there's 3 major watersheds within the forest that we're monitoring, and some of the areas of the forest we've designated as low to no impact, so that we can continue to see what happens as the system recovers from that logging 100 years ago. And then other areas we have designated as where you can do research and actually do impacts, like we did with the SMZ project, where we did a little logging to evaluate things. So the forest is technically open for research from anybody in the university. There's a committee that sort of oversees research activities and different management activities that are going on at the forest. So anybody who wants to do research out there can submit a proposal to the Robinson Forest Committee, and it can be evaluated. And it's a great place to work. It's far away, but sometimes being far away is good. We don't worry too much about, like hikers and trespass and people messing with our equipment. So that isolation for that reason is kind of good. And it's also just nice to get away. It's a great place to get away from the hustle and bustle of city life. Unfortunately, we do have a cell tower out there now, which I guess could be fortunate.
That might be a good thing.
And we have, internet and Wi-Fi and all of the things that, even 10 years ago we didn't have out there. So it used to be great when I would say, I'm going to the woods or going to Robinson Forest, and that meant I was off the grid for however long I was out there. So a little bit of that nostalgia is now gone. But having that cell tower out there allowed us to, helped us get this grant, and, will enable this real-time, streaming of data. But, the forest... it was, like I said, the history of it was logged in the 1915 to 1920 era, and then E.O. Robinson, who had the timber company, essentially at the time they didn't think coal had any value, and so once all the trees were gone, they just essentially handed it over to the university, and so it's been a site of, research and teaching and training, for quite some time now.
Okay, so you have presented us with a lot of great information, and we greatly appreciate all of that. So what would be 1 or 2 takeaway items that you would leave our listeners with?
Well, since we've been talking about watersheds, and this is something I talk about in my classes, we all live in a watershed, and I think it's important for people to find out about what watershed they live in, and find out about, what's going on in that watershed and how these things are affecting, the water quality and the water resources in that watershed. Right now there's a lot of interest, and I mentioned the Town Branch watershed here in Lexington. A lot of that original watershed is sort of underground now, and they're trying to daylight some of it and build lakes and restore, areas. And that will be a massive undertaking, but it's really good for the community to be involved in those decisions and the whole process of doing something like that. So I encourage everybody to find out what watershed they live in, and around Kentucky we have many watershed groups that meet and talk about ways that they can enhance or protect or even restore, water resources in their watershed. And this is a good way for people to get involved in sort of, the beautification and protection of, their own backyard. So that's something I would definitely encourage everybody to look into.
What are some of those ways, just off the top of your head, that people can get involved?
So, for instance, here in Lexington, every spring we have a Reforest the Bluegrass event, which is an event to restore riparian, habitat, and we go out usually to parks and plant trees adjacent to streams. Veterans Park, Masterson Station Park are two good examples where now you can find really big trees along the streams. So there's a lot of other activities that are going on in the Cane Run watershed right now around the Legacy Trail, where we're interested in better management of our stormwater. And so one of the things we're looking at there are development in Lexington, downtown. We are building rain gardens to take in water from streets and parking lots and roofs, and it goes to these things and slowly infiltrates into our streams instead of going directly into them and overwhelming them. So there's a lot of little stormwater management projects that are going on in the city of Lexington that need, that provide opportunities for people to go out and help plant, to clean up. We have a stormwater basin here on campus that we've had a lot of students actively involved in maintaining over the years. And so it's just a good way of providing, some service to your community, but it's also a good way for people to go out and get their hands dirty and have a good time.
Good. Well, thank you, Dr. Barton, for joining us today. And if you would like more information on what you've heard on this segment of today's show, you can visit our website at www.fromthewoodsky.org. Now stay tuned for Wildlife Sounds from the Forest. All right, so for Wildlife Sounds from the Forest, let's play that sound again. All right, so Matt, tell us what that sound is.
So I think this is one that a lot of folks will recognize. We have a lot of them around town. That is your Canada goose.
Okay. Mm-hmm. And tell us about that sound that they're making.
So that's their standard honk. They do make some other songs outside of that that do communicate different emotions or different or hoping to get different responses. So for folks that have the unfortunate history of maybe walking near a nest during the summer or spring, you'll get hissed at. There's some quicker honks, which is all signs of aggression and trying to get you to go away. That happens. Put your hands in the air and look bigger than them, and usually that puts them back in their place. Because they do think, or they are quite, especially the males, the ganders is what they're called, are very aggressive, and then they'll defend the nests. And if you show a little bit more aggression back, they forget how small they actually are sometimes, and it puts them back in their place.
Okay.
So tell us about the Canada geese. Where do they migrate from? Where are they going to?
Sure. So traditionally they do migrate. Unfortunately, here in the last couple decades, we've gotten these lazy geese that stick around. We've got several that hang out on campus. There's other parks in the area that all pretty much have lazy geese. They traditionally would spend their early springs really, March, April, in northern Canada. That's where they would nest. And then after those chicks, those goslings, get older and able to fly, they'll start bouncing around a little bit. But come winter, they'll go south, and depending on how harsh the winter is, it really dictates how far they'll go. But there's quite a few areas that are traditionally known as wintering areas, and that depends on the flyways, which a flyway is basically the traditional migrating route for different areas. So our western part of our state is in the Mississippi flyway. The waterfowl species usually will follow the Mississippi up and down up till it ends, and then continue further north into Canada. So, for example, in the east, on the Atlantic Flyway, one of the big wintering areas was right around the Delmarva Peninsula. So the Delaware Bay, the Chesapeake Bay, and the areas around that will have hundreds of thousands of geese stay there during the winter. And the overall population for Canada geese is somewhere between 4.2 to 5.6 million birds. Mm-hmm. So it's quite healthy, and they are a very popular game species. And somewhere around 2.5 million geese are harvested annually.
Okay. So you mentioned that there are some lazy geese, which we see a lot around campus. And so is there a temperature that it just gets too cold and they have to leave?
So the big thing for them is ability to be on water. Okay. For safety. They do have predators. Coyotes, large dogs are really their big predators. They're large enough at adults range anywhere around up towards 15 pounds.
Oh wow!
For the gigantic Canada geese, mm-hmm. To about 8 pounds for the smaller ones. That's a little big for things like owls or hawks to take mm-hmm. down. Occasionally, a bald eagle will grab one, but really, it's coyotes. Maybe a bobcat if it's lucky, but they'll be on areas where there's water. So it protects them from coyotes and wolves if you're in the right area. Mm-hmm. And then food. They need food, mm-hmm. temperature. They have very thick down, right? Which is those feathers that we hear about goose down feathers.
Down, yeah.
Right, blankets.
Right.
That keeps them very warm. However, they need food, so they'll actually use their body heat and lay in a field to melt the snow to get to the food underneath.
Oh wow!
They have strategies that deal with that, but they'll go south to get to food or water if they need to.
So they are not? Are they not affected by weather then?
They are. They need to be able to keep water open, and mm-hmm. It's zero degrees. They're able to do it for if there's enough geese around kicking the water around and move it. They'll keep it open.
Okay.
Their Latin name is more of the Latin term means dark goose. Which they are dark goose, blackhead. So that's kind of the Canada geese. The Canadensis, so Speranta canadensis, refers to kind of relates to that Canada geese side, right?
Mm-hmm. And so it's coming up on Christmas, and so I guess some people do use these for their Christmas dinner, right?
Yeah, so the Christmas goose, it's especially a European tradition. They didn't eat Canada geese in Europe because they are actually native to North America. There aren't Canada geese over there. Mm-hmm. But it is one that is a common table fare for some folks. And that there's a lot of hunting seasons that relate to that time of year. So, birds come south in the winter. So right about that time, they're available, and our hunting season allows us to do that. There's hunting culture that goes out even on Christmas Day to go try to shoot your Christmas goose. Mm-hmm. They do provide a nice meal in terms of size of the bird. So yeah, and they are one that can cause problems as well. So, which we hear about locally, but they I don't know if everyone remembers the plane on the Hudson. That was actually brought down by 2 Canada geese.
Oh. So,
yeah.
So I had a question about, I know as they migrate, they fly in the V formation. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So separate from that, they do migrate in what we commonly think of as a V formation, and that relates to aerodynamics and the action. So they're a large bird, so there's a lot of energy required to fly. So any kind of drag that can be eliminated will be helpful to them as they migrate thousands of miles. So they'll be in that V formation to help cut down. The birds in the back obviously have less drags than the one in the front, and if I remember correctly, they'll actually take turns leading the pack. And they also do things like fly at a higher altitude. Air's thinner. Usually they actually migrate about 3,000 feet. They've been seen as high as 29,000 feet.
Oh my.
Yeah, so when you think about that plane cruising along when you're flying and hitting a goose, yeah, it could happen.
And how many fly together?
Well, that depends. So subspecies of Canada geese actually have different behaviors. So the bigger the geese, usually there's less of them in a group. But there's called lesser Canada geese, which is one of the subspecies that's about half the size of what we traditionally think, and they'll be in hundreds of birds in a flock. And then, so it depends. It depends on the time of year, but in the winter, those flocks get bigger.
So why is it when they're in that formation, you always hear the honking noise?
Well, they're talking to each other.
Okay.
They communicate quite a bit. They're obviously a social, more social animal than most. So their family units do exist, especially after those fledglings just become able to fly. So they stay in those family groups. So they do communicate quite a bit.
Well, thank you very much. We appreciate you coming in for Wildlife Sounds from the Forest. All right, thank you for joining us today. You've been listening to From the Woods, Kentucky. If you have any questions about things that you heard on today's show, please visit our website at www.fromthewoodsky.org. Stay tuned each Thursday from 10 to 11 a.m. for another edition of From the Woods, Kentucky.
Hey there. If you're enjoying this podcast from WRFL Lexington, you may enjoy our live radio stream at WRFL.FM and, of course, via radio at 88.1 FM in the Central Kentucky area. We have a wide variety of programs you're sure to enjoy. Just go to WRFL.FM/schedule and see what programs appeal most to you. Thanks again for listening to this podcast from WRFL Lexington.